With regard to the parliamentary elections, we are going to see partial elections for the upper chamber of the Egyptian parliament, the Shura Council, the Consultative Council, late July 2010. In October 2010, we are going to see elections for the People's Assembly, the lower chamber of Egyptian parliament, the real parliamentary elections. Once we have conducted the parliamentary elections in 2010, we will know more about the composition of the People's Assembly, opposition representation, government representation, and this People's Assembly is going to be a scene setter. The parliamentary elections are going to be a scene setter for the presidential elections in late fall 2011. Egypt's upcoming elections, parliamentary and presidential in 2010 and 2011, do represent a chance to get Egyptian politics to be better populated, to get a degree of greater pluralism and a better opposition participation and representation in parliament. Elections, however, are not going to make Egypt a democracy, simply because the government, the ruling establishment, still is the gatekeeper. They decide pretty much on who participates and who does not. And this is going to continue. There are no signs for this ending anytime soon in 2010 or 2011, or based on the election results beyond that. There are four major broad issues which do shape the debate approaching the parliamentary and presidential elections in 2010 and 2011. One is democratic reform. Economic development. Egypt still faces economic and social conditions which are not preferable to the majority of Egyptians: poverty, unemployment rates, and deteriorating economic growth rates, and so on and so forth. National security, Gaza, what happens in Gaza, what is going to happen in Gaza, and how to manage that, and Egypt's role in the Middle East and the competition between Egypt and Iran, Egypt and Turkey, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and what does Egypt stand for regionally. This is a country which used to lead the Arab world and has gradually degenerated from a leader to an important, significant actor, and has lost even part of that. So this is a big issue on everyone's mind in Egypt too. Approaching the parliamentary elections, there are crucial questions to keep in mind and to look at. One, international monitoring and domestic monitoring. Is the government going to allow international monitors? Is the government going to allow domestic monitors? So far, we have had no positive practice from the Egyptian government, judged on the elections of 2005 and 2007, the last elections. Second question is the opposition going to be able to coordinate, field joint candidates? Are we going to see an opposition spectrum able to cross and bridge the divide between religious and non-religious opposition, formal and informal opposition, in a way bridging the divide and leveling a greater challenge to the government and the NDP candidates? Thirdly, judicial supervision of parliamentary elections. The constitution was amended to remove, to a great extent, judicial supervision. The details of how the judiciary is going to supervise the parliamentary elections represent a big question too. Finally, what are the techniques, the instruments which the government is going to depend on to get the result which it has been getting from Egyptian parliamentary elections throughout the last decades, which is to keep the NDP majority? Are they going to depend on ruling out the candidacy of opposition candidates before the election day? Are they going to depend on election manipulation on the election day, rigging? All those techniques have been used systematically in the past. Are they going to be used in 2010? The presidential elections are going to be most probably conducted based on the current constitutional framework. The current constitutional framework makes it possible for party candidates, be it from the ruling National Democratic Party or from opposition parties, even if they do not have representation in parliament, to nominate candidates for the presidential elections. Constitution framework makes it very difficult for independents such as ElBaradei to run. If this constitution framework continues to be the binding framework approaching the elections in 2011, this is going to mean that we will have a plurality of party candidates, including a leading candidate from the ruling National Democratic Party, be it it's going to be President Mubarak or someone else from the regime, and a plurality of opposition candidates, but no one of them can level a serious challenge to the regime or to the government's candidate, President Mubarak or anyone else. Should the constitution framework change, and there are demands for that constitution framework to change, and should it be easier for independents to run, there is a great possibility that Mohamed ElBaradei himself is going to run or would run in that case, and maybe a candidate from the strongest opposition movement in the country, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. Approaching the presidential elections, we have a different set of questions to look at. A, who is going to make it? Party candidates or party candidates and independents, which is the latter related to the constitutional framework, and is it going to be amended or not? Is someone like ElBaradei going to make it or not? Is someone like Ayman Noor from Al-Ghad opposition party going to make it or not? He was sentenced for a couple of years, and can he run or not is an issue which is uncertain up until now. Thirdly, and similar to the parliamentary elections, international monitoring and observation. Similar to the parliamentary elections, judicial supervision. Finally, which is sort of the greatest question mark and question to keep in mind, is who is going to be the ruling establishment's candidate? President Mubarak, Mubarak Senior, Mubarak Junior, or someone else? President Mubarak has been ruling Egypt since 1981. He is in his 5th term, which ends in 2011. Before his sickness in the spring of 2010, it was widely expected in Egypt and outside that he is going to run for a 6th term, that he is going to be regime's candidate in 2011 for a 6th term. With his sickness, with his absence for a couple of weeks from Egyptian politics, with popular doubts about his health condition, it's a question mark whether President Mubarak will run. I wouldn't rule it out, but it's a big question mark which exists out there. President Mubarak's son, Gamal, has been groomed for a long time, in fact now for 10 years almost, to become the successor. Has been groomed to succeed Hosni Mubarak in ruling Egypt. Of course, succeed and follow democratically, seemingly democratically, in multi-candidate presidential elections, similar to those which we had in 2005, and according to the constitution, the elections which Egypt will see in 2011. He has been groomed to become the successor. However, in the last 10 years, and this is a long time, he has failed to get a better level of popular acceptance. His popularity rates have remained constantly low. Secondly, he has failed to prove himself as a potential leader, as someone to lead and govern Egypt, which is not an easy country to govern and is not an easy region. He has failed to prove himself, and therefore the possibility of Gamal running, becoming the candidate of the government for the presidential ballot will stay there, but there's a big question mark too. And then we are left with the possibility of someone else from the ruling establishment making it, someone like the current prime minister or a military figure, an unknown, sort of keeping the military establishment's control over the presidency, which has been the case since 1952. So those are the issues I tend to not to rule out any one of them. We will have to wait until the end of 2010 until we see how different dynamics are unfolding in Egypt. Egypt's opposition has remained divided since 2005. We are still looking at an ideological divide between religious-based opposition, the Muslim Brotherhood, and secular opposition parties, liberal, leftist, and networks of activists. The opposition is divided across a second layer, which is formal and informal opposition. We have established opposition parties which have by and large become less relevant for Egyptian politics. Many of them have bought into the government's game of restricted pluralism and have come to be domesticated opposition of sorts. And we have informal groupings, movements, such as the National Movement for Change, established by Mohamed ElBaradei. The dynamism of Egyptian politics as of now is primarily related to informal activism, to informal opposition networks. But the greatest hindrance those groups are facing, or those leaders are facing, such as Mohamed ElBaradei, is that the constitutional framework does not allow them to become more active, does not allow them to quickly form a party, to run in parliamentary elections, to contest presidential elections. They are faced with a set of restrictions which, in spite of their vibrant nature, in spite of their dynamism, makes them less relevant for Egyptian politics. Mohamed ElBaradei's return to Egypt has changed political dynamics in two significant ways. One, he gives the opposition, informal and formal, a consensus candidate. They can rally around him. Secondly, Dr. ElBaradei's return has meant a return in Egypt, in fact, to the debate about how to amend the constitution, how to introduce significant political reforms, and he is helping to keep the government accountable for what happened domestically in Egypt between 2005 and 2010. He has reminded Egyptians of Mubarak's promise to lift the state of emergency. He has reminded them of his promise to make it easier for political parties to participate. So he has pushed Egyptians and public debates back into more of a concentrated debate on democracy than it was the case in 2008 and 2009. Egypt's role in the Middle East has been facing growing challenges from competing states, Turkey, Iran, but even from small states such as Qatar. Egyptian roles in mediating between Fatah and Hamas in Palestine, in stabilizing Sudan, in pushing for Arab-Israeli conciliation. At all those levels, Egyptian roles have been challenged, confronted by other states in the region. Egypt's role in the region has been reduced as well because there is a perception, a growing perception in the region, that Egypt is preoccupied with its own domestic affairs, that Egypt is in a moment of domestic uncertainty, and because of that it cannot project enough power regionally to perform its role and conduct itself based on a proactive perception of what a big country like Egypt needs to do. So the fact that Egyptian domestic politics and political dynamics are in a moment of uncertainty has impacted negatively on Egypt's regional role. The elections, should they result in not in a democratic but in a more pluralist political dynamics, in a more forward-looking, more confident Egyptian polity, are going to impact positively on Egypt's regional role. Egypt, as of now, lacks the vision which it can communicate to the region to convince. It's not enough to say we are for peace. You have to add to peace moderation domestically, you have to add to peace human rights, you have to add to peace democracy. The region, the Arab world, chose that it's not easy to stand for peace, but it's not convincing to stand for peace while you are harassing opposition activists domestically.